Hi, I'm Tim Oliver. I'm the Director of Bands here at Arkansas State University and the conductor of the Arkansas State University Wind Ensemble. We'd like to invite you to join us here as part of our rehearsal, talking about some ideas regarding the John Philip Sousa composition, the Gallant 7th. The form of this piece is a little bit unusual because it has an extended introduction. There's still a first and a second strain and a trio, but there's actually two break strains in this particular march, which you'll hear a little bit later when we start rehearsing it. One of the things that I've always found with this particular march is that there's a tendency of the players to rush in this particular march. And that's mostly because the quarter note rhythm is so predominant throughout this entire piece. However, if we focus on the harmonic content as well as the harmonic rhythm, not only does the tendency to rush decrease, but also the musical richness which Sousa has composed tends to also increase and be brought to the forefront. So we'd like to give you some ideas on how to maybe bring some of those suggestions into your rehearsal. Now, in this introduction, I'd like to hear just the trumpets for just a moment, and you're going to hear the regimental theme being established right away here at the beginning. So let's start just with the first measure, guys. Good, and that's going to be repeated in every odd measure. Now I want to hear just the second measure, and this is where the richness of the harmonic content comes in. All right, the second measure, please. Good. And if we extend this idea to the fourth measure and to the sixth measure, which we're going to do here in just a second, you can hear that there is an extremely large number of chord changes here. This piece starts in F major, but by the time we get to the third measure, we're already to the relative minor of D minor. Let's go one chord at a time, please, right at the second measure. Now in the fourth measure, we're going to pick up on that D minor chord and extend it on a little bit farther. Right there we get a B fully diminished 7 chord, which is a tritone away from where we started. So now we're going to start in that sixth measure and continue on, and we're going to head back home to a unison F. Now the reason I break this down is because when students are listening for those chord changes, their tendency to rush goes down quite a bit. So let's put that in context now with the regimental trumpet part and now with all of those chord changes that are occurring in the introduction. So the harmonic rhythm here is fast. Even though the harmonic rhythm is fast, we don't want to rush. Introduction, please, everybody. And so now we've set the table, because here in this introduction we have the regimental trumpet theme, we have a fast harmonic rhythm, and we have a lot of exotic, to a certain extent, harmonic content that's going on. So as we start in the first strain, this is another unusual formulaic element of this piece, because the first strain doesn't start right on the tonic key. It doesn't start with tongue notes or any sort of strong downbeat. It actually starts with a series of 7 slurred notes. Again, all the harmonic rhythm is changing on every one of these notes. And then we actually get sort of a jazz inflection, in the sense we get a 2-5-1 progression before we actually get to the tonic. So once again, just the 7 slurred notes. Again, listening for the rich harmonic content. And 1. And the other thing that's occurring here, whenever I hear groups play this piece, there's a molto crescendo right here. And a lot of times people overdo the crescendo because it ends with a forzando at the end. And a lot of people overdo that and they ignore, again, that rich harmonic content. So what I want to suggest is let the crescendo happen, but not at the expense of all the harmonic content. Let's try now, you're going to hear the trombones, especially when they play these half notes on beat 2, because they're going to play a G minor chord, then they're going to play a C7 chord, which is the 5-7, and then we finally get to the tonic of F major. And so the trombones are the only ones that are playing these particular half notes, and so it's important that they be brought out. Can we start trombones, please? This is in the second measure. And 1. Good. So we're going to hear this in context now. The 7 slurred notes, that trombone choir leading to the tonic finally at the beginning of the 4th measure. Here we go. Everybody please. First string. So this is one of those things that it takes a while for this first string to start. And a lot of times people ignore the rich harmonic content of the slurred notes and also the trombone choir here before we actually get to, in the 4th measure, the real, as I would say, the real beginning of the first string. So let's go through this time and play the entire first string as written. Here we go. Also another rich opportunity after letter B, the 4th and 5th measure after letter B. Again, harmony changes a little bit since we're, again, floating into that relative minor key of D minor. And you're going to hear the tubas and some of the other low voices play these half notes. And there's also a crescendo right there. The reason why Sousa put that crescendo in there is not necessarily for the musical effect, but also, in my opinion, to emphasize the harmonic effect that's going on right there. Let's start, if we can, please, gang. This is pickups to letter B, pickups to letter B. And when we get to that section, we're going to try to emphasize those half notes so that we hear that harmonic change, not necessarily just a crescendo, but a harmonic change there too. Right before B. And oftentimes, just asking the ensemble to be aware of those type of changes is often just as effective as asking them to crescendo a whole lot more. Because if you crescendo a whole lot more, then I think you lose the subtlety that Sousa is asking for here. Right? Let's play the entire first string now, please. The entire first string. I've actually heard some people that will say that the various elements of a Sousa march remind them of a little multi-movement symphony. I don't know if that's true or not, but what I can speak to is the fact that when we get to the second strain, there's a much different character here. And not only do we have some different thematic elements, as you would expect in a Sousa march, we also have a much slower harmonic rhythm. And as that harmonic rhythm starts to take over, some of the other elements that are written in the melody, again, can be brought to the fore. Let's start, if we can, please, in the second strain. And one of the things in the second strain that is really almost buried is that there's this neat counterline in the alto saxophones and the bass clarinets. And it's sometimes really difficult to get that line to come out, but it actually they're playing this E diminished arpeggio over the top of the C major chord, and so that has that element of kind of angst without being any sort of dramatic, harsh or any sort of loud accented type of harmonic content or dynamic content for that matter. So I want to ask just the saxophones, just the alto and tenor saxophones and bass clarinets to start here at the beginning of the second strain, and so you can hear this counter melody. Right? Good. There's also one other element, 2 before letter D, the baritone saxophone and the tubas get to play this nice little, again, arpeggiated figure, but it has a triplet that sets it up. And a lot of times I think of this as almost like a kick in the sense of dun, digga dum, bum, 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 bum. And without that little kick, that phrase doesn't turn over on itself and we don't repeat starting in the second half of the second string. Can we hear just the tubas and bass and the baritone saxophone, please? Good. And this time we're going to add the bass drum and the cymbals, and they have a forzando on beat 1, and so that triplet is going to lead into the bass drum on the forzando, this is right 1 before D. Okay? 2 before D, everybody? And oftentimes, thank you, and oftentimes you'll hear bass drum and cymbal too powerful in a Sousa march. Sousa himself would often say that the bass drum should be felt and not heard. And so this is one of those ideas that we want to hear the accentuation with the bass drum and cymbals, but not overpowering what's going on over here, right? Everybody, please, this is the second string. By the time we get to the trio, this first time through, the harmonic rhythm now becomes drastically much, much slower. In fact, here in the first 6 measures, there's 1 chord change. And so, unlike the introduction in the first and second strand, the harmonic rhythm now at this point is going to get much, much slower. And as a result, we're going to hear some different configurations in the ensemble's scoring and playing. For example, in the second and third clarinets, there's an interesting bass line part in the bass clarinet, and the second cornet part actually foreshadows the regimental trumpet that's going to come just a little bit later. So we're going to have everybody start at letter E, and then we'll highlight a few parts. This is right at letter E, please. This is the trio. And this isn't labeled as the trio in the score, but it is the trio because we're modulating to the subdominant. It has all the characteristics of the trio, just doesn't say trio in the score, but this is the trio. Trio, please. Now, here at this first time at the trio, I'm going to ask that we hear just the bass clarinet and the second cornet, just so you can hear this part. Right at letter E, right on it. Now, again, when you hear that, you'll hear that rhythm that we heard at the introduction, just like at the introduction, and the vigorous bass clarinet part here. And if you ask your players to balance to those 2 sounds, then when you ask your second and third clarinets to play all of the arpeggios that they're about ready to play, that's going to be much more easily heard. As we approach the end of this trio strain, before we get into the first break strain, the articulation changes 4 after F. And so when the articulation changes again, as is often the case in this particular march, the harmonic rhythm changes again. And so instead of these long measure after measure after measures where we don't have a chord change, now all of a sudden we get to 4 after F and we're having a chord change every quarter note. So can we start, please, 4 after F so we can hear those chord changes? Now we'll play that in time and allow, again, the richness of that harmonic content, which is now being slurred, allow that to carry rather than trying to add anything extra. Let the harmony do the work right here. This is right at letter F, please, right at letter F. And we finally get to the first of 2 break strains. This first break strain, as you can hear, is all about the regimental trumpets. And when I ask the regimental trumpet parts, and by the way, depending on the edition that you're playing, this particular edition has a separate regimental trumpet part. So I would encourage you to, as you're programming this piece, to be very mindful of the fact that some of your trumpet players aren't going to play for quite a while in this particular piece. Let's hear just the regimental trumpet part, please, here at the first break strain with the pickup. Thank you. And again, you can hear that's all unison through there. And you don't have to do anything extra to it. Just allow it to occur. You don't have to, and you don't want to hear accents. You don't want to hear this sort of content. You just want to allow that to occur naturally, as though it was a bugle call calling the army into action, because that's what it's intended to do. Now, we're going to hear that with the interjections of sounds. The percussion has a snare drum and bass drum, or excuse me, a bass drum and cymbal, and then the rest of the wind players play dot in various harmonic configurations. So start right at the break strain, please, right at the first break strain. One of the challenges of the articulations of this particular march occurs one measure before I. I hear a lot of bands when they play this, they don't spend a lot of careful time making sure that they tongue accurately and aggressively enough all 6 of those eighth notes leading into letter I, because that is the propulsion that gets us across into the next measure and into the next phrase. So make certain that when your students are tonguing there, they're tonguing aggressively and with some musical direction. Now, at letter I, when we start the trio again, we now have the regimental trumpets. We still have the bass clarinet line. We still have the second and third clarinet line, but the second cornet line that we had a second ago in the first part of the trio is now gone. And so I would encourage you to listen to the second and third clarinets, the bass clarinets, as well as this regimental trumpet part, because there's still a long way to go in this march. Remember, this march is a little bit longer in terms of the form and content than some of the other Sousa marches, so you don't want to show the ending just yet because we're not there. This is at letter I, please, gang. Letter I, balancing to the second and third clarinets, bass clarinet, and the regimental trumpets. Take it nice and easy. Here we are, pickups to I. And again, you can hear as we start to end this trio strain that same change of articulation and then the increase of the harmonic rhythm. Those are really important characteristics. And again, our percussion section's doing a nice job of not overpowering that. A lot of times I hear percussion sections that try to overpower and overdo right there. Just let the harmonic content do the work. Let's do that one more time, then we'll go on into the second break strain. The second break strain that we have is very different than the first break strain. The first break strain was all about the regimental trumpets. This is all about what some march historians might call a dogfight, in the sense that this is really very aggressive harmonically. There is a series here at about the fifth measure where we actually have French 6 chords and German 6 chords and secondary dominance of harmonic content is everywhere here. And so the intent is not to let it be overpowering from a dynamic standpoint. Again, I think it's important to let the harmonic content do the work. There's a reason why Sousa wrote this harmonically the way he did. He wants the tension to be drawn here. He wants the drama to come forth here. He doesn't necessarily want a large amount of volume. Remember, there's still a ways to go in this piece. So we're going to start at letter K on the first break strain, or the second break strain, excuse me, and you're going to hear that same articulation pattern that we talked about before letter I going into the recap of the trio. Again, that's very prominent in this particular break strain. This is right at letter K, please, the beginning of the second break strain. Now, as we progress into the recapitulation of the trio, this is the third time that we're going to hear the trio. One of the challenges of this piece is because you've heard this thematic content now, this is going to be the third time. It doesn't say this in the score, but one of the things I would encourage you to do is, again, allow your regimental trumpet players to shine through here. Oftentimes in the score, you'll see this written as a fortissimo, maybe even a fortissimo. I would encourage you not to do that. I would encourage you to have everybody be at a piano or maybe even 1-2 apart, and then allow the regimental trumpets to carry this trio strain. Because again, when you hear it again and again, you think to yourself, okay, what's different this time? And this is an interpretive thing. And you may disagree with this, and that's fine. But I think you'll hear when we recap it for the second time at the end, it'll be a much different effect and have a much more powerful effect by doing it this way. So we're going to start the second time, or excuse me, we're going to start in the second break strain again, and first time through letter M. We got it? All right. The difference there when you ask everybody to play 1-2 apart and play softly there, because now this part comes through very, very easily, and you hear some of these things in terms of the harmonic content, the change of articulation, and when you replay it a second time after the repeat, then you can add the counter melody and some other people that give you that last dramatic push that is so often found in a Sousa march. This is the second time, please, at letter M. Second time at letter M. With pickups. And one of the things that we work on as far as march interpretation is the last note. And there have been many a march, unfortunately, that has been ruined by the fact that somehow musical reason and musical good sense can sometimes abandon in an ensemble when they get to the last note. So one of the things that we talk about with the last note of how we treat the last note is that we just want to give it a little pat. And that's all. Because if we give that last note one of these, it doesn't have the kind of character that we're looking for. So we just like to take that last note and just give it a little pat. We're going to start at letter N and see if we can make sure that we pat that last note. That's the idea. We hope you've enjoyed spending some time with the Arkansas State Wind Ensemble and our ideas and interpretations of John Philip Sousa's The Gallant Seventh. Thank you very much.